Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to look at the need for validation checks and the different types of validation checks there are. We're also going to understand the need for verification checks to be made on input data and the different types of verification checks there are. In the exam, you'll be asked to define what these checks are and suggest possible checks for a particular scenario. So let's begin by looking at what validation checks are. Validation checks are basically checking that the data that you've input is reasonable or within a set boundary. For example, making sure that the number is entered for an age, that could be a present check, you've got to enter it, or that it is reasonable. For example, having somebody's age to be around 200 for a human might not be appropriate. It could also mean limiting the range of numbers that can be entered, for example, between 15 and 55. It is normally an automatic computer check. So the computer does it on its own, looks at the logic, and then suggests whether the data is acceptable or not. Common examples are range check, length check, type check, presence check, format check, and check digit. We'll go through these one by one. A range check assesses whether data is within one or two bounds. For example, an age must be between 0 and 100. A date must be before today's date, so you can't put in a future date. Range checks can be programmed using selection to produce an error or within a loop that keeps asking you to enter a value until it is valid. Now on screen, you see two examples, one using selection. This will only check the data once, and the second one is using a loop, and this will keep on checking the data until the user enters the correct data. So we input a number in both cases, and using a selection, we check whether it's between 1 or 10. If it's not, for example, if it's less than 1 or greater than 10, we output invalid. Otherwise, we output valid. Now the same applies in a loop. So instead of the if selection, we just have a while loop where we say while the number is less than 1 or the number is greater than 10, keep asking for the input again and again. And it will not allow the user to enter any other number unless it is between 1 and 10. Pause the video and have a look at that because you will be asked to implement this in the exam. The next validation check is length check. A length check will check the number of characters that are present. For example, the data has a string, and when you output length brackets the data, it will count the number of characters there are, including the spaces, and output that. Now you can use any type of pseudocode. You can say the data.length with brackets, length brackets the data, len brackets the data, or the data.length. All of them basically mean the same thing. We're going to work out the length. And this allows the programmer to code this function the way they want in their programming language. Now we can do this the same way. Two examples are on screen. Pause the video and study both. One uses a selection to check the length of the data. Is it less than 10? Then invalid. If it's over 10, then it's valid. The second example uses a loop, and we do exactly the same thing. While length of data is less than 10, output invalid, and ask the user to enter the data again. And it'll keep asking it until the user puts in data which is at least 10 or more. Next is a type check. Data can be in different forms, for example, integer, real, string, Boolean, and we can use the data.getDataType brackets function, which will allow us to check the type of the data and output whether it's valid or invalid. For example, if you take a bit of data and say data.getDataType brackets is not equal to integer, then output invalid. So we can use that with a selection or a while loop as well. So that allows us to check if the user is entering the right type of data when they're asked for an input. So pause the video and study both examples and then move on. A presence check makes sure that some data has been entered. If you leave the field blank, then it will generate an error. Now we can do it multiple ways. We can use the value null, we can use empty strings, and anything that checks whether a field has some value entered into it. Pause the video to see both examples. One uses selection, the other uses iteration. They work exactly the same way. Input some data. If data equals null, then output invalid, or input the data while data is equal to an empty string, output invalid data, input it again, and that loop will continue until the user enters something. Leaving it blank is not acceptable. Next is format check. Some data may need to be entered in a specific way. For example, date must be date slash month slash year, where each space is a number. A format check makes sure that data is entered in this particular way. This is slightly complex because we have to think of multiple parts. So pause the video to see how both the selection and the iteration variants work for this format check. However, the process is the same for both. We're going to use the substring function where we take a string and then we define a start position in that particular string, for example, position 3, and then we say how many characters we want back from it. For example, from position 3, give me 2 characters back. So using this method, we can say substring ID number, which has been input, position 1, bring the first character back. For example, our ID number needs to be a number followed by 2 characters. So we extract the first character out and we check whether that is numeric. If that's true, and then we check the next 2 characters, substring ID number, start with position 2 and bring 2 characters out. If that is text, if that is true, then that means the output is valid, otherwise the output is invalid. So we extract the first character and check if it's number, and then we extract the next 2 characters and we check whether those are strings. And we can do the same thing for the dates. So we input the date and then we check in a loop whether the first 2 characters are numeric, if that's false, or whether the third character is not a slash, or the next 2 characters are numeric, or the following one after that is not a slash, then the output is invalid and we ask for the input all over again. So we can create quite complex validation mechanisms for format checks by simply extracting characters out one by one, or maybe more than one, and then compare that to text, numeric, and so on. The final validation check is a check digit check, and the check digit is calculated from a set of numbers and is input with the numbers. So when the data has been input, the calculation is performed on the data again using the same algorithm, and the result is compared to what was input. And if they match, therefore the data entered is correct. Now on screen you see an example using modulo 11, and there are a lot of different check digit algorithms. In an exam, chances are that you're not going to be asked to code this particular algorithm, but if they want you to code a check digit algorithm, then they will actually give the algorithm to you. The algorithm that you see on the screen allows you to enter a 5-digit number, including the check digit, and it uses the first 4 digits to work out the 5th check digit. It then compares the value to the input value, and if it matches, that means that the data has been entered correctly, otherwise it's entered incorrectly. So the way it works is that the user inputs the code, and then it uses the div function to work out each separate digit. For example, digit code div 1000 will work out the first 9 from the 9999. Then we update the code variable to subtract 9000 from the original, which leaves it to be 999. We repeat the process with div 100 because that will now work out the 900 part. We subtract it, then we get 99. We then do the same process again with div 10, which gives us 90, and we subtract that. Finally, digit 4 becomes 9. That means that the 5th value, which is remaining in the code, becomes the check digit because we subtracted everything else out. After that, we follow the modulo 11 algorithm, which basically takes each digit, digit 1, 2, 3, 4, and multiplies with its place value, which begins with 1 from the right-hand side, and 2, and 3, and 4. The total statement shows how that is worked out. And if there was a 5th digit, we'd probably multiply it by 5. Then we work out the new check digit, which is the mod of the total by 11. And then finally, the new check digit is assigned the value 11 minus this check digit that we worked out. So if new check digit works out to be 9, then new check digit will be 11 minus 9. We then compare it to the check digit that has been entered, and if it matches, then we output it was entered correctly. Otherwise, we output it wasn't entered correctly. Now, the algorithm is complicated, and of course, you'll be given this if they ask you to do a check digit validation in the exam. But as long as you follow the steps, it's going to be very easy to implement because it is a basic mathematical calculation. Okay, let's move on to verification. Now, when we enter data from another source, for example, a paper copy, it's very important to make sure that you enter data exactly as what was written originally on that piece of paper. This process is called verification, a check that you have copied the data accurately. Now, there's a difference between entering data accurately and entering the correct data. For example, if the piece of paper that you're copying from has incorrect data, then you will, of course, type in inaccurate data into the computer. And that's where validation might come in to check if the data entered is reasonable. So they both go hand in hand. Verification only checks you've copied it accurately. The actual data may still be incorrect if the original was incorrect. Now, there are normally two forms of verification that you need to be aware of, a visual check and a double entry. A visual check is where you compare the data entered to the original. For example, reading each line from a paper copy and checking if it is identical on the computer as it is on the piece of paper. A double entry check is where the same data is entered twice, usually by different people, but it could be the same person. Think about your password entry, you have to type it in twice. The computer will then check whether there are any differences in what was entered in both instances by comparing one set to the other. And if it matches, then everything's okay. If it doesn't match, then it identifies the mistake. Okay, that's all there is to validation and verification. You should be able to answer the following questions. You should be able to explain how validation works. You should be able to list 4 validation checks. You should also be able to explain the difference between validation and verification. You should be able to describe how type check works using an example, how check digit works using an example, and how format check works using an example. And finally, you should be able to describe 2 verification checks. If you have difficulty with any of these, please do get back to me. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.